time of Jesus. How kitchens were heated in Jerusalem and why they were the most important room. The charcoal crackles beneath my hands as I blow gently on the embers. My eyes sting from the smoke that fills this small room, but I can't stop now. The sun hasn't risen yet, and my family will wake hungry. The clay oven embedded in the corner radiates heat that makes this cramped space almost unbearable, even in winter. This is my world. 4 walls blackened by soot, a floor of packed earth, and the eternal dance of fire and bread. But here's what most people don't understand. This room, this smoky, suffocating kitchen, was the beating heart of every Jewish home in first-century Jerusalem. Why did families risk deadly fires every single day? What made this space more sacred than we imagine? And how did a simple cooking fire become a profound symbol of God's presence among His people? Stay until the end, because what Jesus said about lamps, bread, and fire will transform the way you read the Gospels forever. Jerusalem in the first century wasn't the romanticized city of golden stone we see in movies. It was a city of stark contrasts, where Herod's magnificent temple complex towered over homes so small that an entire family shared a single room barely 12 feet across. The average dwelling in the lower city, where most Jews lived, consisted of 1 or 2 rooms built with rough limestone blocks and roofed with wooden beams covered in clay and straw. Archaeological excavations in the Jewish quarter reveal that these homes rarely exceeded 400 square feet total. Within this tiny footprint, one space dominated all others: the kitchen, or more accurately, the cooking area that consumed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire living space. Understanding why requires us to confront a brutal reality. Survival in ancient Jerusalem meant managing fire in an age when fire could destroy everything you owned in minutes. The city had no fire department, no running water in most homes, and building materials that burned readily. Yet every single day, Jewish families had to kindle flames hot enough to bake bread, cook lentils, and boil water. The kitchen wasn't just important, it was the most dangerous, most labor-intensive, and paradoxically, most sacred space in the home. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, describes how fires in Jerusalem's densely packed neighborhoods could leap from house to house, consuming entire blocks. Despite this terror, the kitchen fire burned daily, because without it there was no food, no warmth, and no life. The architecture of survival. How Jerusalem's kitchens were built. But the danger of fire was only the beginning of the story. The design of a first-century Jerusalem kitchen reveals an engineering sophistication that modern people rarely appreciate. Unlike the open hearths of Greek and Roman homes, Jewish kitchens centered on a tanur, a clay oven that stood between 2 and 3 feet tall, shaped like a beehive, and embedded partially into the floor or built against an exterior wall. Archaeological findings from the burnt house in Jerusalem destroyed in 70 AD show a tanur still in place with the remains of charcoal at its base. This wasn't primitive technology. It was precisely calibrated for the needs of a kosher Jewish household. The tanur operated on a principle of retained heat. Women would spend the pre-dawn hours feeding small pieces of dried wood, olive pits, or charcoal into the oven's base, gradually raising the interior temperature to between 600 and 700 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough that the interior walls glowed. Once the fuel had burned down to embers and the smoke cleared, they would slap rounds of dough directly onto the scorching interior walls, where they would bake in minutes. The Mishnah, compiled in the early 3rd century but reflecting 1st century practices, devotes extensive discussion to the tanur, including debates about what makes it ritually clean or unclean, how to repair cracks without rendering it unusable, and when a tanur damaged on Sabbath, Eve can be used for the Sabbath meal. But here's what creates the first profound connection to Scripture. The tanur required constant attention and intimate knowledge. A woman couldn't simply turn a dial. She had to understand wind patterns, wood moisture, dough consistency, and the precise moment when the oven had reached optimal heat. This knowledge passed from mother to daughter, creating an unbroken chain of wisdom that stretched back generations. That's why when Jesus speaks of women preparing bread, everyone listening understood he was referencing not a simple task, but a complex art requiring skill, patience, and experience accumulated over a lifetime. The woman searching for a lost coin in Luke 15:8 isn't foolish for lighting a lamp in the middle of the day. She's searching a dark, smoke-stained room where the cooking fire has blackened every surface, making a silver coin nearly invisible. The kitchen's physical layout tells us even more. Because the tanur generated intense heat and dangerous smoke, it was typically positioned near the home's entrance or in a courtyard shared by multiple families. The Tel Yokneam excavations in the Galilee region show cooking installations positioned just inside doorways, allowing smoke to escape while keeping the fire accessible. But this created a theological paradox that Jews of the era recognized immediately. The most important work of the household, the preparation of food that sustained life, happened in the most public, most vulnerable space. Wealthy families might have separate cooking rooms with better ventilation, but for the vast majority, the kitchen fire burned where neighbors, beggars, and strangers could see it, smell it, and be drawn to it. The sacred rhythm, fire, bread, and the Sabbath. And it was precisely at this point that the kitchen's importance transcended mere survival and entered the realm of the sacred. Jewish law required that the Sabbath fire be kindled before sunset on Friday, because lighting a fire on the Sabbath itself violated the commandment to rest. This meant that every Friday afternoon, women across Jerusalem engaged in a carefully choreographed dance of preparation. The Mishnah tractate Shabbat describes how 2 cooked dishes must be prepared before the Sabbath begins, kept warm on coals covered with ash, a practice called hatmana, or insulation. Imagine the scene. As the sun descends toward the Judean hills, casting long shadows through Jerusalem's narrow streets, thousands of kitchen fires burn with special intensity. Women hurry to complete the week's most important cooking, preparing enough food to sustain their families through a day when no work can be done. The tanur glows with heat. Loaves emerge from its walls. Lentil stew simmers in clay pots balanced on iron tripods above carefully banked coals. The smell of fresh bread mingles with roasting lamb, cumin, and coriander. When the shofar sounds from the temple, signaling the Sabbath's arrival, every fire in the city transitions from active cooking to passive warming, from flame to ember, from work to rest. But there was a bigger problem that modern readers miss entirely. How do you keep food warm for 25 hours without actively maintaining a fire? The solution reveals the ingenuity and legal precision of first-century Judaism. Cooked food was placed in vessels that were then buried in hot ashes or surrounded by materials that retained heat, wool, feathers, or dried grass. The Tosefta, an early rabbinic text, specifies that one may not add fuel to these coals on the Sabbath, but one may adjust the covering. This means a Jewish woman had to calculate, before the Sabbath began, exactly how much heat her coals would generate, how her insulating materials would perform, and whether her food would remain both warm and safe to eat through the next day. Archaeological evidence confirms this practice. Excavations at Qumran, home to the community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, reveal cooking installations with thick layers of ash containing pottery vessels, exactly as the Mishnah describes. These weren't just following tradition. They were solving a technical challenge that required deep understanding of thermodynamics, food safety, and Jewish law. And here's where Jesus' words illuminate everything. When he spoke about not being anxious for tomorrow's food in Matthew 6:25-34, his listeners weren't hearing abstract philosophy. They were thinking of Friday afternoons, calculating whether they had enough flour, whether their fire would hold its heat, whether they had prepared adequately for the day of rest. Jesus was speaking directly into the practical anxiety of kitchen management. The economic reality, fuel, labor, and the cost of daily bread. What seemed like a simple matter of cooking was actually an economic burden that shaped every family's budget and schedule. Fuel for cooking fires wasn't free, and in the rocky, deforested landscape around Jerusalem, it wasn't even cheap. By the 1st century, the forests that had once covered Judea's hills had been largely harvested for construction, metallurgy, and cooking. The Talmud records that wood vendors were among Jerusalem's regular merchants, selling bundles of kindling and larger logs at the city gates. For poor families, the majority of Jerusalem's population, fuel costs could consume 10 to 15% of their income. This economic pressure drove innovation. Women collected dried dung from animals. Donkey, cattle, and sheep droppings that could be dried formed into cakes and burned as fuel. The prophet Ezekiel's command to bake bread over human excrement, Ezekiel 4:12, shocking as it sounds, referenced a real practice used in sieges when normal fuel became unavailable. More commonly, families used agricultural waste, olive pits left over from oil pressing, grape pomace from winemaking, and straw from grain threshing. Each fuel type had characteristics women had to understand. Olive pits burned hot and long but created creosote buildup in the tanur. Straw burned quickly, requiring constant feeding but producing less smoke. Dried dung burned steadily but had to be completely dry to avoid toxic smoke. The Mishnah's discussions about fuel types reveal how seriously Jewish law took these practical matters. One tractate debates whether certain materials can be used for cooking on holidays, when work restrictions were slightly relaxed. Another discusses whether borrowed fuel must be returned in kind or can be repaid with money of equivalent value. These weren't abstract theological musings. They were addressing daily questions women faced. If my neighbor shares her olive pits, how do I repay her fairly? If I gather wild scrub from public land, have I stolen? Can I use wood from a broken piece of furniture? Or does that violate rules about destroying useful items? And it was exactly here that everything changed in our understanding of Jesus' ministry. When he spoke to women at wells, in houses, and along roads, he was speaking to people who spent 3 to 4 hours every single day managing fire, fuel, and food. The woman at the well in John 4 wasn't just making small talk when she mentioned the depth of the well and the effort of drawing water. She was calculating water for drinking, water for cooking, water for ritual washing, water to dampen down the fire if it got out of control. Every jar she carried up from that well represented physical labor in service of the kitchen's demands, the social world of the kitchen, women, work, and witness. But no one could predict what would come next when we examine who actually worked in these kitchens and what their labor meant for the spread of the gospel. In first-century Jewish society, the kitchen was overwhelmingly women's domain. The Mishnah explicitly states that even a woman who brought multiple servants into her marriage must still grind grain, bake bread, and cook, though she could delegate other tasks. This wasn't oppression in the modern sense. It was specialization in a world where survival required mastery of complex, dangerous skills. The typical day for a Jewish woman in Jerusalem began 2 to 3 hours before dawn. She would rise while her family slept, make her way by oil lamp to the kitchen area, and begin the process of rekindling the fire from the previous night's coals. If the coals had died, a disaster requiring her to borrow fire from a neighbor or strike sparks with flint and iron, she might lose an hour or more. Once the fire was re-established, she would grind grain into flour using a hand mill. 2 circular stones, the upper one rotated by a wooden handle, crushing grain between them. The Talmud records that the sound of grinding stones was one of Jerusalem's characteristic noises, a rhythmic scraping that began before dawn and continued until mid-morning across the entire city. Archaeological evidence from the burnt house shows a complete grinding installation still in place. A lower millstone carved from basalt, weighing approximately 40 pounds, with a socket for the upper stone that would have weighed another 30 pounds. Operating this mill required strength, endurance, and technique. The Mishnah specifies that a woman must grind enough flour each week to make bread for her household, a quantity that could reach 15 to 20 pounds of grain, requiring hours of continuous grinding. The physical toll was enormous. Skeletal remains from first-century Jewish burial sites show distinctive wear patterns on women's arm and shoulder bones, evidence of repetitive grinding motions performed thousands of times over a lifetime. But here's what makes this relevant to understanding Jesus' message. These women grinding grain, managing fires, and baking bread were the same women who became his most devoted followers. When Luke 8:1-3 mentions women who supported Jesus' ministry out of their means, we should picture women who understood budgets, who knew the exact cost of a day's flour and fuel, who could calculate whether they could afford to follow an itinerant rabbi and still feed their families. Women like Joanna, wife of Herod's steward Chusa, who managed a household kitchen complex with multiple servants. Women like Susanna, whose name appears nowhere else in Scripture, but who was important enough to Luke to mention because her kitchen skills, her ability to organize food preparation for a traveling group, were essential to the movement's survival. The kitchen was also where women gathered, taught, and shared news. Because cooking required constant attention but not constant mental focus, once the fire was established and the dough set to rise, there were intervals of waiting. The kitchen became a center of female community. Mothers taught daughters, neighbors borrowed and lent. News traveled from kitchen to kitchen faster than through any other network. When Jesus performed miracles, when he taught in the temple courts, when he faced opposition from religious leaders, the news spread through Jerusalem's kitchens as women shared information while tending their fires. The sacred fire, symbolism, sacrifice, and the presence of God. And it was precisely in this everyday reality that we discover profound theological significance. Fire in the Hebrew Bible wasn't merely a tool. It was a manifestation of God's presence. The burning bush that Moses encountered blazed, but wasn't consumed. The pillar of fire led Israel through the wilderness. The altar fire in the temple, kindled initially by God himself according to Leviticus 9:24, was never to go out, burning continuously as a sign of perpetual worship. Every Jewish person in Jerusalem could look up at the Temple Mount and see smoke rising from the altar, knowing that at that very moment, the sacred fire was consuming sacrifices on behalf of the people. But here's the staggering connection most people miss. The same Hebrew word, esh, designated both the holy fire of the altar and the common fire of the cooking hearth. The fire that consumed the burnt offering and the fire that baked the daily bread came from the same divine gift. Jewish tradition, preserved in later rabbinic writings but reflecting earlier beliefs, held that fire was one of the things created on the first Sabbath eve at twilight, neither fully part of the created week nor fully part of the Sabbath rest, but a gift suspended between human work and divine rest. This theology transformed the mundane kitchen into sacred space. When a woman kindled her cooking fire, she was participating in the same act as the priests kindling the altar. When she carefully banked the coals before Sabbath, she was honoring the same rhythms of work and rest that God himself established at creation. The Mishnah records blessings to be said over fire, particularly the fire kindled after the Sabbath ends, when the first flame of the new week bridges the sacred and the ordinary. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the lights of fire. A blessing that acknowledged fire as gift, fire as danger, fire as necessity, and fire as miracle. Archaeological discoveries illuminate this reverence. In homes throughout Jerusalem, tanur ovens show evidence of careful maintenance and repair rather than simple replacement. When an oven cracked, a common occurrence given the thermal stress of daily heating and cooling, families would patch it with fresh clay mixed with straw, sometimes incorporating small stones or potsherds. The Mishnah devotes extensive discussion to when a repaired oven is considered the same oven and thus retains its ritual status, or a new oven requiring reconsecration. This wasn't legalistic obsession. It was treating a kitchen tool with the seriousness reserved for sacred objects. That's why when Jesus spoke about light and lamps, his metaphors carried layers of meaning impossible to capture in translation. In Matthew 5:15, he says, "Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a basket. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house." The lamp he's referencing isn't decorative, it's the essential light source in the kitchen. The small clay vessel filled with olive oil and fitted with a flax wick that allowed women to work before dawn and after dusk. Positioning this lamp correctly meant the difference between safely managing fire and accidentally burning down the house. Jesus was saying, you are as essential to the world as the lamp is to the kitchen, as vital as the light that allows daily bread to be made. The heat, the hunger and the hope, physical realities and spiritual meanings. What seemed like the end was only the beginning when we consider the physical toll of kitchen work and how it shaped spiritual understanding. The temperatures inside a first-century Jerusalem kitchen during baking could reach 110–120 degrees Fahrenheit, even in winter. In summer, when the Jerusalem sun already heated homes to 90 degrees, the kitchen became almost unbearable. Women worked in this heat for hours, their faces flushed, sweat streaming, eyes burning from smoke, because there was no alternative. The Talmud records that one of the signs of a righteous woman was bread that came out perfectly from the oven, not burned, not undercooked, but golden and fully risen. This seems like a simple domestic detail until you understand the variables involved. Dough mixed the previous evening had to ferment overnight in a society without climate control, meaning temperature fluctuations could make it rise too fast or too slow. The morning's humidity affected how quickly the tanur reached temperature. The quality of the week's flour, ground from grain that might have been stored for months, influenced how the dough absorbed water. Getting it right required not just skill but prayer, acknowledgement that human effort alone wasn't enough. This is why the petition in the Lord's Prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread," resonated so powerfully in first-century Jerusalem. It wasn't abstract. It was a cry from the heart of every woman who woke before dawn, wondering if she had enough fuel to heat the oven, enough flour to make dough, enough strength to complete the day's work. Jesus taught his disciples to pray for bread daily, because bread was daily, a never-ending cycle of labor that began again each morning regardless of the previous day's exhaustion. The physical reality extended beyond heat to include danger. Burns from the tanur were common, hands brushing against scorching interior walls while placing dough, arms singed by flames, faces scarred by sparks that flew when dry wood caught fire too quickly. The Mishnah discusses legal liability when a woman's fire escapes her control and damages a neighbor's property, revealing that this wasn't a rare occurrence but a regular risk. Yet women worked daily with this dangerous element because their family's survival depended on it. And here's where Jesus' compassion becomes even more profound. He consistently noticed and honored women's domestic labor. When he spoke of the kingdom of heaven being like yeast that a woman mixed into flour, Matthew 13:33, he was elevating an act performed daily by millions of invisible women to the status of divine metaphor. The kingdom grows like bread rises, quietly, inevitably, through the patient labor of hands that knead and shape and wait. When he entered Peter's house and healed his mother-in-law in Matthew 8:14-15, the text immediately says she got up and began to wait on them, not because she was forced to, but because for a Jewish woman of that era, resuming her kitchen duties was proof of healing, evidence that she could once again fulfill the role that defined her place in the household. The community kitchen, sharing, hospitality, and early church formation. But there was a bigger transformation happening that would reshape everything. As the early church began to form after Jesus' resurrection, the kitchen became one of its most important gathering spaces. Acts 2:42-46 describes believers breaking bread in their homes, eating together with glad and sincere hearts. This wasn't merely social fellowship, it was logistically complex. Feeding large groups required multiple families pooling resources, coordinating cooking efforts, and managing the exponential increase in fire risk and fuel consumption. Archaeological evidence from house churches in Jerusalem and other first-century cities reveals modifications to domestic spaces to accommodate larger gatherings. Some homes had courtyards enlarged or interior walls removed to create more space. But the kitchen infrastructure, the tanur, the storage jars, the grinding stones, remained in place, meaning that women continued to do the physical work of food preparation, even as the spiritual significance of their shared meals expanded. When Paul writes about the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 11, he's addressing problems that arose when wealthy and poor Christians gathered together, and some had abundant food while others went hungry. This wasn't about a formal liturgy. It was about the practical reality of kitchens that could produce very different quantities and qualities of food depending on the family's wealth. The division was visible and visceral. Wealthy women had servants to grind grain, fire built from purchased wood, and tanur ovens that received regular repair and maintenance. Their bread was fine, made from carefully sifted flour. Their meals included meat, eggs, and honey. Poor women ground their own grain on cheaper millstones that produced coarser flour. Their bread was dark and dense. Their meals centered on lentils, leeks, and onions. When both groups came together in a house church and shared a meal, Every loaf of bread proclaimed the economic inequality that the gospel was supposed to transcend. This is why Paul's instructions about the Lord's Supper emphasize waiting for one another and sharing without discrimination. He wasn't addressing merely a spiritual problem. He was confronting a kitchen problem, a problem rooted in the daily reality that different women brought different resources to the communal table. The solution required wealthy women to deliberately choose humility, to use their better ingredients and better equipment to serve everyone equally, to let their servants work alongside poor women as equals rather than social inferiors. The final fire: destruction, hope, and resurrection. And it was exactly when this transformation was taking root that disaster struck. In 70 AD, the Roman army under Titus besieged Jerusalem, and when the walls finally fell, the city burned. Josephus describes the conflagration in devastating detail: flames leaping from building to building, the roar of collapsing timber, the screams of people trapped in homes that had become infernos. The burnt house excavated in the Jewish quarter preserves the moment of destruction, a kitchen frozen in time, with a tanur still in place, cooking pots shattered on the floor, and on one wall, a spear point that may have belonged to a Roman soldier. 3039. In that kitchen, archaeologists found something that brings tears to those who understand its significance: a human arm bone, likely belonging to a young woman, reaching toward the doorway as if she had tried to escape, but was overcome by heat and smoke. She died in the space where she had spent most of her life, among the tools she had mastered, beside the fire she had kindled countless mornings. Her name is lost to history, but her final position tells a story of desperation, of futile flight from the flames that had been her constant companion. Yet even in this tragedy, early Christians saw resurrection symbolism. Just as the kitchen fire had to die each Sabbath eve and be rekindled after the Sabbath, just as the daily fire began each morning from the previous night's coals, so too would God's people rise from ashes. The destruction of the temple meant the end of the altar fire that had burned for centuries, but the gospel fire, the message of Jesus Christ, continued to spread through the kitchens and homes of believers throughout the Roman Empire. Women who had learned to manage fire in Jerusalem carried that knowledge to Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, and Rome. They kindled cooking fires in new cities, baked bread in unfamiliar ovens, and around those fires they taught the gospel to their children, their neighbors, and the strangers they welcomed with hospitality. The book of Acts is filled with named women who hosted churches in their homes: Lydia in Philippi, Priscilla in Rome and Ephesus, Nympha in Laodicea. Each of these women managed a kitchen complex capable of feeding dozens of people, organized fuel supplies and food preparation, and supervised the domestic infrastructure that made early Christianity's communal life possible. Conclusion: the eternal flame and our daily bread. When we observe the kitchen in first-century Jerusalem, we realize that we've been looking at far more than ancient cooking technology. We've been witnessing the intersection of the sacred and the ordinary, where divine provision met human labor, where women's daily work became a living parable of God's faithfulness. The kitchen was the most important room not because of its size or its beauty, but because life itself depended on what happened there. The transformation of grain and water into bread, the conversion of raw ingredients into meals that sustained families, and ultimately, the gathering of believers around shared tables where the presence of Christ was made known in the breaking of bread. Every element we've examined reveals profound theological truth. The tanur oven, heated to scorching temperatures through patient labor, mirrors the refining fire of God's love that shapes us through trials. The daily grind of grain into flour illustrates the breaking down of our old selves to create something new. The careful banking of Sabbath coals teaches us about rest and trust, about stepping back from our work and believing that God will sustain what we've prepared. The shared meals of the early church, prepared in kitchens by women whose names we often don't know, demonstrate that the kingdom of God advances through ordinary acts of service and hospitality. The same God who gave fire as a gift at twilight on the first Sabbath eve continues to kindle light in our hearts today. The same God who commanded the altar fire to burn perpetually maintains the flame of the Holy Spirit within his people. And the same God who taught Israel to pray for daily bread still provides for our needs each morning, inviting us to depend on him with the same trust that a woman in Jerusalem showed when she kindled her fire before dawn, not knowing if she would have enough fuel or flour, but believing that God would provide. If you've ever felt that your daily work is too ordinary to be spiritual, too mundane to matter in God's kingdom, remember the kitchen in Jerusalem. Remember the women who spent hours in smoke and heat, whose skilled hands transformed grain into bread, whose patient labor fed the families that became the early church. Their work was not less important than the priest's work in the temple. It was equally sacred, equally necessary, and in the end, equally used by God to accomplish his purposes. The kitchen fire may seem far removed from the altar fire, but in God's economy, both are holy. The woman preparing a meal for her family is engaged in work as spiritually significant as the priest offering sacrifice, because both are participating in God's provision for his people. Jesus elevated this truth when he chose bread and wine, the products of kitchen labor, to represent his body and blood. He could have chosen anything, but he chose the most common elements, the food prepared daily in countless kitchens by countless women, and made them the center of Christian worship. As we conclude this journey into the kitchens of Jerusalem, I want you to see your own daily labor with new eyes. Whether you cook meals or perform other repetitive tasks, whether you work with your hands or your mind, whether your labor is public and praised or private and unseen, know that if it is done in service to others and in dependence on God, it is sacred work. The kitchen teaches us that holiness isn't confined to temples and grand gestures. Holiness burns in every fire kindled with prayer, in every meal prepared with love, in every act of service performed with humility. And if this documentary has strengthened your faith, if it has helped you see the Gospels with fresh understanding, if it has made you appreciate the women whose names we don't know, but whose labor made the early church possible, I invite you to share this video with others. Click the like button to help more people discover these historical insights. Leave a comment telling us what surprised you most about kitchens in ancient Jerusalem. And subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future explorations of the world Jesus knew. Remember that every time you read about bread in the Gospels, you're reading about hours of labor. Every time you encounter fire in Scripture, you're encountering a gift that required constant vigilance. And every time you share a meal with others, you're participating in the same sacred act that defined the early church. The recognition that we need God for our daily bread. We need each other for community, and we need to remember that the kingdom of heaven grows quietly, like yeast in flour, through the faithful labor of hands that serve in love. Until the next video, may the God who gave fire as a gift, who provided manna in the wilderness, who taught us to pray for daily bread, and who revealed himself in the breaking of bread continue to sustain you, guide you, and kindle his light within your heart. May you see your daily work as sacred service, your ordinary tasks as opportunities for worship, and your home, whatever its size, as a place where God's presence dwells and his provision is made known. God bless you.